Hi everyone, thanks for joining us today. I hope you're having a lovely day wherever you are. I'm Ollie, I'm Head of Partnerships in Codebase, an incubator based in Scotland, but we also deliver a LawTech program called LawTech Bridge with Barclays in London. And we were meeting up once a month until about a month ago when obviously everything kind of stopped. So we've moved all of the stuff we're doing online, which is kind of cool because we can reach a bigger audience and meet more people from the LawTech community. So yeah, I'd just like to hand over to Sophia at this point, who's going to be telling us all about the future of legal tech adoption, as you can read on the screen. Sophia is Head of Strategy and Policy at Wavelength, that's right, isn't it? And has been involved in LawTech Bridge, our get-together in London, both as an attendee and also as a speaker before, which is awesome. So really delighted to have her along for today's webinar. So yeah, I'll pass over to you, Sophia.
Great, Ollie, thank you. And thank you for having me joining this virtual webinar. I think it's brilliant that you're continuing the work of the bridge in this virtual way to keep the momentum going. And hi to everyone who's made time to join us this afternoon. So I'm going to talk you through a little bit about my own personal views on what the future of legal tech adoption looks like. First of all, I'm just going to give us a quick run through of the history lesson. I just feel I've been doing so much homeschooling with my kids. I'm a great teacher now. So yeah, welcome to Soph's School on History. We're then going to do a little bit of comparative analysis. I'm going to look at some trends and also look at what we've been seeing in other sectors like fintech and whether or not we can learn anything from that. And then borrowing from my old trade as a strategy and futures person, I'm going to use some very simple scenarios to test out some possible futures, because as the last month or two has proven, no one can actually predict what the future is going to look or feel like. But we can probably have a best guess based on a few assumptions, and then at least try and aim for one of those. The better planned we are, the better able we would be to then manage the unexpected. And isn't now an exact example of that. So first of all, I probably ought to tell you a little bit about who Simmons Wavelength are. For those of you that don't know Wavelength was one of the first regulated legal engineering companies. And by that, what I mean is, unlike some of the other amazing contributors to the law tech sector, we don't develop point-to-point solutions. We're not a software developer. We don't do bespoke AI tools for one kind of a problem, but rather we bring a multidisciplinary approach to solving legal problems. And by that, what I mean is we combine data science, we combine technology, legal ops, design thinking, and policy, which is my background, in such a way that we try and solve the problem with a 360 using innovative technologies and approaches, so innovation being as much about culture as it is about the technology that you adopt, to try and solve and reinvent or rethink the way in which legal services could and should be provided. And in summer just gone, which feels like a really long time ago, doesn't it? We were acquired by Simmons & Simmons, hence we are now Simmons Wavelength. And my role there is really to focus on the intersection of technology, policy, and the law. Okay, so on to the history lesson. It's fair to say that it's been a short history of legal tech, even though we seem to have been talking about it forever and a day, but actually the real explosion has been relatively recent. And one of the big news stories of the last sort of 18 months was actually around this huge influx of investment around AI-based technologies and solutions. And so what have we seen? In the context of technology adoption, I think you could probably, without really even looking at law as a sector, expect us to ride this lower half of the curve here, which in old business speak would have been called the Death Valley ride. The early ideas without much of a sales pipeline, but with real potential. And if you look at some of the technologies that we now see as commonplace, they all went through this. And so for me, I think it's useful to set the context of what we're seeing in law tech and legal innovation within the broader spectrum of what happens normally in the adoption cycle of new technologies or new ways of doing things. And there's a dichotomy here between those things which are expensive and take a lot of investment of time, highly regulated industries, and those which are products and services that you can acquire quite quickly, where the development costs aren't quite as high and where the purchase costs actually drop off quite quickly when you get to scale. Cell phones being a really good example of that versus planes. Even though we all fly them, pretty sure most people on this call don't own one. And if you do, let me know. That said, there is a point in time where we find ourselves now in law and in legal innovation of being at that chasm. So this graph, many of you will have seen. It's a very traditional graph of technology adoption. And across legal innovation, we saw some really exciting stuff a few years ago. Lots of investment was flowing in, a huge plethora. People talk about the complicated landscape in which LawTech has become, but actually there's this huge chasm in the middle before it becomes a mainstream, and we are absolutely still at the foothills of that chasm, nowhere near overcoming it. And I'll explain what I mean and why I think that is the case in a moment. So there we are, we're in from the innovators moving into the foothills of the chasm. So we've got some real examples of early adopters. The Siemens acquisition of Wavelength is an example of that. Fuse at A&O as an example, MGR Labs as an example. We've got GC teams adopting technology. All of these are early adopters experimenting. And I think I would describe where we currently are as very much still in the experimental phase. This is, I told you we were going to do a slight sort of homeschooling thing. This is a report card. This is actually borrowed from a report which the Law Society of England and Wales, a big wave and shout out to those guys, my old team produced last year, which is a summary of findings around the degree of LawTech adoption. And I didn't put the key on there, but essentially if you're orange, it's definitely a D. If you're in the green, you're definitely in the A territory, maybe an A- heading to an A+. And in essence, what we're seeing is, compared to the other sectors, and I accept that some of the definitions between FinTech and SureTech and RegTech, they're all a little bit nebulous, but mainstream hardcore LawTech development still lags, both in the size of the ecosystem, so the number of players, both in the funding. As much as I spoke about a huge influx of funding, that was relative to what was there before. Compared to other sectors like FinTech, completely different ballgame. There's some structural reasons for that, of course. The market is different, the players are different, the data sources are different. Current level of disruption, compare LawTech and FinTech, right? So anyone got a Monzo bank account, anyone doing their payments on their app, that's a very different look and feel to where we are in law at the moment. I would say regulatory environment also has a real big play. And again, the structured nature globally, not just of the UK, this is really important to speak about this. Globally, the legal structures around the regulation of legal services remains highly conservative. In the UK, in actual fact, we sit on a fairly liberal end of the spectrum, but compared to our peers in the US or in Southern Europe, with the exception of the Nordic countries, actually the majority of other jurisdictions are highly regulated, concentrated on a model that still resembles somewhat the guilds of old that Richard Susskind often talks about, and they're not prime territory for innovation and real disruption and change. And likewise in B2C and B2B adoption, that remains low. And that is a really important part of the dynamics here, because we're talking about a sector of the economy. And at the heart of that, you want to really understand the supply and demand, and where the demand is not begging, where the demand is not yet ripe, and where the demand is not yet prepared, able and capable, that has a really important feedback impact on the supply. Some of the drivers are really important to look at. Again, this comes from the Law Society adoption reports. And essentially my point about demand, client pressure sits highly as one of the most strongest drivers for change. And this isn't unique to law, of course it's not, but it really does play out. And we hear it and see it all the time. And that has that's borne out over the last few years in two ways. One, actually more people are talking about legal innovation. Why? Because the pressure on the client, particularly in the GC market, is so severe on them being a cost center that they are passing that pressure down the supply chain to their legal teams externally to demand greater efficiencies. But equally, it cuts both ways, because if that client itself isn't yet capable of really, in essence, realizing the potential of what technology and innovation, different ways of delivery can do, they can also act as a blocker to change. And I think many of us on this call today might well have experienced that, the fear factor of using a new technology or a new way of doing something on a problem that they already have. They sometimes feel far more comfortable doing the same old thing, even though somewhere deep in their gut, they know that it's more costly, slower, less satisfying for them. One of the other real problems with blockers to change and adoption has been legacy systems. So again, really not unique to law, but actually if you look at some of the markers of the way in which law firms, particularly law firms, large and small, are structured, what happens to their CapEx spend, what happens to their profits at the end of the year, all of those heighten the pressure on impacts such as things like legacy systems. This is actually a Commodore 64, for those of you that don't know. Dear to my heart, was the first ever computer I owned. And there are, thankfully, I don't think I've seen one in an office, other than for entertainment's sake. But there are huge sunk costs in existing legacy systems, which until you find the tick over of that happening, i.e. they just become obsolete because they're no longer supported, then in actual fact, we're going to see a real delay in changing an approach to the use of technology and innovative ways and practices of work. Example, cloud-based computing. This will be no surprise to anyone, the billable hour. It is a problem for many. Some might well resist that accusation, but the report done by the Law Society, reports done by many other institutions, and anecdotally talking to both those in the sector and those who are using those services, the billable hour structure has held back progress. Partly because it speaks to a particular way of culture, and also because of the way in which the billable hour is structured. It doesn't lend itself to design sprints. It doesn't lend itself to thinking about things in project terms. I'm not saying that law firms aren't capable of doing those things. In actual fact, some of them, and in my own experience, some of them have done brilliantly well, but they've had to work against a culture and an approach and an entire structure of an organization, the way in which money flows through its mechanics to get that done. And that cost of what we call in economics friction really matters. It shaves away profitability, it shaves away efficiency, it reduces the scalability, it reduces the way in which people might attach themselves to a new way of working if it's just too hard to do. So it's far less likely to become the norm. It will remain somewhat on the fringe. This is my favorite picture in the whole deck, by the way. I have no idea how that cow got there. If anyone has an idea as to why cows might find themselves in this position, let me know in the chats and I'll look it up later. There's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of photos of cows stuck on roads, mainly in the US, as far as I can tell. Anyway, cow stuck on barrier. You can do your own captions for this, but there are some technical barriers, right? So there are some technical barriers for the way in which these things might work. And they could be either around adaptability, it could be interoperability between systems. There can be, I think, an overzealous narrative of the way in which technology can just solve everything in law. In actual fact, some of the things that we do in legal services are actually incredibly complicated and very, very nuanced. And we don't yet have that sophisticated degrees of machine learning capability, or at least we haven't been able to train it on enough data for it to be able to solve the problems that we're looking to solve. And so there are some natural technical barriers in this sector, which can only be solved by this sector. So we can't quite borrow from others. So I did joke to Oliver that I was just going to leave this on and see how many people eventually fell over. But one of the other great challenges to adoption has been just the confusion around legal adoption. And that ranges from the myriad of solutions available. So many people have spoken about this before. This is not a unique thought on my part at all. But actually, when you have 30 options, all of them saying they broadly do the right thing, and you don't come from a school or a discipline that is able or trained to decipher between the strap lines on the box, so to speak, it's really hard to make a choice. And when that choice is something that it might be the first choice you've ever made, it might be the first time you've been allowed to spend money in an innovative way. It might be that you're using it in a particularly complex environment or in a particularly important area of your business. They're all risks. And where confusion really takes hold is the fact it delays decision making. It stops people from even playing if they think the risks of trying are just too high, and trying being those decisions around trying being just so complicated. I think it's also worthwhile noting that actually, even if we had not a particularly vibrant ecosystem with lots and lots of suppliers doing similar things, the buyer, there's still a gap. There's an asymmetry, a very strong asymmetry of capability. Whereas the buyer in these instances tends to be someone who doesn't come from a technical or an engineering or a software background, and they're having to make decisions about something that actually is not their norm. And that asymmetry, again, slows down the purchasing process. Neatly segueing into this, which is, even without all of those, the sales cycle in law is slow. An example of that might be if you're going to adopt a particular way of file management in a firm, for instance, that might be a decision that has to be made by a series of partners. There's not a simple Xcode that will make that decision for you. The collective decision making within private firms actually might slow that down. Conversely, in an in-house environment, it might be that even though this would be a bewilderingly brilliant solution and make that team hugely more efficient and effective, they still have to sell the idea to someone else, because ultimately an in-house team to most corporates is a cost center. And you only invest in that cost center if you've got a really clear mandate and very clear set of arguments displaying and describing the ROI. And that's really difficult if you're a startup. And certainly Wavelength's experience was this too. When you're small and your cash flow is limited and you've only got maybe months of money rather than years of capital saved up in a bank account somewhere, that actually that slow cycle of selling really impacts both on the ability to enhance the capability of the solutions that you've developed, or indeed simply to survive. Now, I wonder if this is going to work. I told you I love homeschooling, but let's just see.
Galileo made his most controversial announcement. He said he was sure, based on his observations, that the sun was not moving around the Earth. Instead, the Earth was orbiting the sun.
Pretty profound, hey? But the reason I played that, not because I just love the animation, but more to the point, in the same way as Galileo was trying to convince the world that our system was sun-centric, in the same way in legal services, the penny has yet to truly drop, that actually it's about being client-centric. It's not about the expertise sitting at the top of the hierarchy and then doling it out to those who are willing to pay for it, but rather really focusing around customer needs, understanding your customer, providing a service which is 360, delivering it in ways that is easy for them to use further down the chain, at times that is most helpful to them, in ways that are most helpful to them. I think people have realized that that is a thing that matters, but actually how you operationalize that is really difficult. And actually in some quarters, and with some, we talked about legacy earlier, some organizational cultural norms are embedded in a legacy of a lawyer-centric world, not a customer-centric world. And I think in the same way as Galileo's affirmation of Copernicus's work was so profound, I think that is the profound moment at which things would really change, which is really speaking to the needs, being absolutely outcome focused, not knowledge focused. And I know that's a really tough thing to deliver. I want to very quickly now turn to the comparative. So that's what's happening in law. That's my analysis of where we are at the moment and what the barriers are, what the challenges might be. But what are we seeing across technology as a whole? What are we seeing in sectors that people often compare LawTech to in this kind of hopeful sort of a way? So this is a stats summary which TechNation developed and issued recently. And you'll see some of the statistics, and some of them are really promising, hugely promising for the UK. If you look at here, I love the fact that actually Manchester is Europe's fastest growing major tech cluster. I think that's amazing. I think that's brilliant. We're not a huge nation. That shouldn't be so fundamental. We've been trying to find some alternative to the Industrial Revolution and digging up coal and pottery making for decades. Good job that we found a solution to at least some of our woes. And those figures are really profoundly important, as is the one on the left-hand side of the screen, where it puts the UK as being first in Europe for scaling tech. And I think that again speaks to the context in which LawTech is taking off in the UK and the fertile ground that we can hopefully make the most out of. But I want to very quickly draw this to your attention, which is adoption rates in Fintech. This was taken from the EY 2019 report. I don't know if you know, EY do an annual report on Fintech adoption. The figures are amazing. First of all, China and India, way out there. But if you look at the UK figures, again, we've got something like, I am going to have to put my glasses on. I am going to now look as if I'm peering right at you. Just, I can't read the actual figures. 71%. You compare that anecdotally to what you feel the sense of readiness is to start using legal innovation and legal tech tools in either the B2B or in the B2C markets. It's a profoundly different experience. And that has a feedback loop, a huge feedback loop. If you look at some of the reasons why there is such an adoption, why are people reaching to new ways of banking? It's not because they just want to change, because actually as humans, we quite like repetition. We like the norm. Why? Because it's secure, because it doesn't require much in the way of risk. If it's worked before and it works again, great. The win has to be something, the gain has to be something that you really want, that it really appeals, that has a real return on investment for you. And if you look in the consumer markets and the B2C markets, what's the greatest attraction there? 64% are actually seeing a financial incentive. And in the SME sector, it's about range of functionality and features. Why? What is that? That's about being customer centric. Banking historically provided, on the face of it at least, a facade of being really consumer friendly, nice people behind the bank tellers, tills and so on, nice looking branches. The cost of banking looked like it was free. In actual fact, it's not. It's all hidden in your interest rates and all that kind of stuff. But actually, if you're an SME, banking works really terribly for you. The traditional high street banks didn't historically treat SMEs particularly well at all. And the new disruptors actually saw an opportunity to really try and change the way in which that experience looked. So it wasn't necessarily cost, but it was just functionality that really worked in the SME sector. This is a little bit more, I'm going to skip this because I think I've more or less made the point here, which is there's some really clear lessons to be learned as to what's the rationale for adoption. And it's understanding that rationale in adoption for law, which is really going to help us understand how do we make a grander impact on the day-to-day delivery of legal services if we feel that adoption, i.e. the demand side of the equation, is so important. There's some stats just to share. So again, we're looking at quite big increases actually in the consumer markets on this attractiveness of rates and fees from 13% to 27% between 2017 and 2019. That's not very many years, actually. It's quite a big uptick. And 66% of the SMEs focused in on the functionality and features. And I think they have direct comparisons to law. The other big thing here is the amount of public policy support and infrastructure that has supported the change in fintech. You have all of the major players with central government support playing an active role. And by that, I mean not just sitting on the sidelines and saying it's not a problem, but actively encouraging, supporting. So when I was the acting head of strategy at the FCA, for instance, we had just not long launched the sandbox, now regarded as one of the most successful sandbox in financial services globally. And the FCA now host and lead a global version of that. But we also had the Bank of England doing work on digital currencies. We had the open data, the open banking initiative, which was a huge driver in banking, because actually it gave those disruptors all of that data. All of the data that the incumbents, those big banks on the high street, had been holding on to. And that consumer-based data was really the stuff that fueled the ability to develop new ways of working. And that came from central public policy changes. And it's interesting to see that even though you might say that we work in a relatively liberal context here in the UK when it comes to regulation of legal services, we don't see that liberalisation necessarily taking place globally. And neither do we see really strong public policy drivers that are fundamentally going to change the game. But that doesn't mean to say we're absent of any of that. The LawTech Delivery Panel, which is now hosted by Tech Nation and led by Christina Blacklaws and Jennifer Swallow, doing an amazing job on their 6 task forces, looking at infrastructure level changes, but that's some way off. So we're lagging. And until we get some of that kind of support, I wonder to what degree actually we're going to see a real uptick. The challenge here, of course, is the data problem. Everyone talks about the data problem. The data problem is a real problem in law, simply because actually the court data that some people want to get hold of is really difficult to draw down for many reasons. And I'm not suggesting there is blame. There is definitely a legacy problem there. But also when you have such a disparate number of actors in the market itself, the data about private interactions in legal services remains within relatively small pockets. So unlike banking, where we had just a handful of major banks, all with massive pools of data, where they had 3 or 4 financial services related transactional data about every consumer for every day of every year. Just imagine the magnitude of that data pool. We don't have that in law. And so I think when sometimes people compare LawTech to FinTech, we have to understand what the raw material available to us is likely to do to both that curve, but also the size of the market. There are initiatives, of course. So Engine B, if anyone is on the call from Engine B, big shout out to you guys. They are looking at trying to construct some form of data taxonomy is another way of describing it. I know there's better language. If anyone is on the call, then remind me of the language that you're using to describe it. But essentially to try and codify and develop a consistent way of collecting data across a sector, across practice areas in law, so that it's easier for information to flow and to be read across. And that's a really interesting initiative, huge potential if we get that right. If you look also at the great hubs, what's interesting about here is the hubs in FinTech are not actually that dissimilar to the hubs in LawTech. So you've got, in Europe, you've got the UK, and haven't we done brilliantly? We've got Germany, and we've got Sweden. Okay, so if you look at some of the LawTech hubs, very interestingly, very similar. We have a hub in LawTech globally in Singapore, which isn't necessarily, unless I'm not seeing it, it's only reflected in this chart. But of course, I mean, Japan and China and India play a huge role in fintech in a way that Singapore is trying to lead the way in Forest Asia. And of course, the North American contingent. And interesting, the dynamics here are really interesting, because as much as there may be huge amounts of innovation taking place across the US, particularly on that West Coast, they're still operating with a very conservative legal regulatory structure, which is actually holding back, I think, the way in which that could command a real sweeping change across that sector. So on to the future, part 3 of my lecture, and then I'll hurry this up and get to the point. For those of you old enough, like me, to know, this is Emmett Brown, and this amazing device helps him see the future. He sticks like a sticky thing on your forehead. Now, I was going to try and mock one up, get my children to help me. We ran out of time. So maybe for the next one, Ollie, I will try and bring a prop. But it's also one of my favorite films, because it's just funny and it's great. But let's have a look. But in the same way as Emmett Brown really couldn't tell the future, neither can I. So what I'm about to share with you now is just my best guess as to what I think are the parameters that matter, and the ways in which the structure of our thinking. And I think that structure of thinking is something that is really helpful, because if you have a framework for thinking, you can really plan for the future. And if you're a startup in this territory, or you're thinking of starting something up in the legal tech framework, thinking about these sorts of dimensions is a really standard approach to looking at scenarios, and it's a great way of business planning. So here's a 2-for-1 today. Okay, so first of all, what do we mean by the future? And I think it's helpful to think about 3 time horizons here. Now, in any piece of work, when you're doing futures analysis, you set your time horizons, right? So if you're thinking about climate change, we might be talking about 25-year time horizons, or actually 10-year time horizons, as it now turns out. But what I think usefully for this conversation, we have 3. One is the most immediate term, the 1 to 3 years, and that noticeably has changed. If you'd asked me to do this like 2 months ago, I would have said pretty much steady as it goes. But actually, as we've seen, the current economic snap recession that we're all about to enter into, that France went into yesterday, is going to have a profound effect on the sales cycle, and I think is going to require some real planning and some rescue jobs for those who are currently in that funding crunch. Then there's the midterm, the 3 to 5 year time horizon. That's where some of the most exciting stuff potentially could happen, because that's where you go from being an idea that might work to one that's really taken hold, to the ability to really get into and under the skin of this particular sector. And I think what happens to LawTech and legal services over the next 3 to 5 years is definitely worth focusing on. And then 5 to 10 years is the least certain, but also in some ways the most important, because there I think the question we're asking ourselves is, realistically, what is the height of our ambition for this time horizon? And then plotting and planning towards that, rather than this nebulously having this concept that the future, some point in the future, will look different. And I think not being able to articulate how different we mean that to be doesn't help those who are either trying to plan and work in the sector, and doesn't help for those who are within the sector to change. So, as I said, there are many plausible futures. And for those of you who believe in multiple dimensions, there's definitely more than one plausible future. But I think there's some useful key dimensions that are worth a conversation here. And I have split them up into the following, which is skills. I think that matters. Where we end up in those 3 trajectories, skills is one of them. There's buyer adoption, technology developments, by which I mean, to what degree can we really use machine learning to help solve some of the very complex questions, but also efficiency gains in greater, faster computing capability. Tech consolidation. So, that spinning picture I showed you earlier that hopefully didn't make all of you sick. Actually, there is something about the degree to which this sector starts to consolidate. Profitability, and by that I mean profitability of the private firms, both on the high street and in the B2B sector. Next up is competition. I think that matters. That has a relationship with profitability. And infrastructure, by which I mean things such as the UK Jurisdiction Task Force of the LawTech Delivery Panel, chaired by Geoffrey Voss, did its paper on crypto assets. That kind of infrastructure clarity, certainty matters, because what we know is markets that have uncertainty don't develop as quickly or as vibrantly. Uncertainty leads to chilling, basically. It chills markets. If people are not certain how things are going to pan out, it slows people down. And so infrastructure changes. And that also includes my point around data, right? So to what extent can we expect the data infrastructure in law to change in such a way that supports the greater use of technology and using that data to really learn lessons? So I have plotted, I think 3. We'll figure out how many I've plotted in a minute. I think 3 scenarios. Best case scenario. This is not my dream states. This is not like, you know, Sophia, if you had a dream, where would you be? Not locked in my house is the answer actually at the moment. But anyway, this is based on my own assessment of where we are, the likelihood of progress, like a pragmatic, honest view. Where do I think these dials would move? Now, the unshaded dials are where I think we currently are. So that's in most cases, it's to the left, apart from profitability, and I'll come to that in a moment. And where I think we're likely to get to, if I'm thinking out to the 5-10 year time horizon, are the shaded in dials. So on skills, for instance, I think we have a real dearth of the right skills in the sector, both on the buyer and on the supply side. Part of that is because actually things like data science capability are hugely in demand, and we're competing against some amazingly large institutions. And we don't have that many data scientists, but also the skills to even think about how you apply data science to a legal problem. They don't really exist. The skills of using project management, they're not given in law. The sorts of law students we're churning out in law school still look a lot like the law students we churned out when I graduated. There has been huge amounts of movement and great willpower by certain deaneries. You know, I'll shout out UCL and Anna Donovan, you know, the College of the University of Law. I think Swansea are doing an amazing job. South Bank are doing a brilliant job. Manchester, amazing. But I can still probably count them on a hand. And then you look at the UCAS booklet. Do they still produce a booklet? I don't know, but that's how old I am. I had a UCAS booklet, right? There are many institutions where you can go and study law, and still the majority of those are operating in a way that looks identical to 25 years ago. And that is not going to churn out the kind of legal minds and behaviors and competencies that we want, because it's not about legal knowledge. The one thing that our academic institutions do amazingly well in the UK is legal knowledge. I don't doubt for a minute that we churn out some of the smartest legal minds. It's the competencies, it's the skills around listening, collaborative working, innovation, which requires you to fail. And most academic career paths in law don't teach you to fail, not gracefully anyway, not without a good fight, possibly in court. But I do think that if you gave me 10 years, that I think we could really move that dial. The seeds are there, they're in some fertile ground. We've got some great folk in some of those institutions I've mentioned who will lead the way. And globally, we're seeing the same. So i.e. in Spain, I know my colleague Erica at Simmons Wavelength, hello to Erica, she's out there, teaches an amazing course there. And if anyone's ever come across Erica, you'll know that when it comes to a modern take on legal innovation, Erica embodies that. And so we're seeing institutions really valuing that kind of an approach. Northwestern Pritzker Law School in Chicago is another example of that. So there are these pockets globally where people are really beginning to appreciate that legal services is going to need a new type of lawyer. But it's going to take us 5 to 10 years because actually the academic process is slow in change anyway, and we don't yet have a tipping point. And neither do we have investment. So, you know, if I was serious about this and I was still in Whitehall, I would say, how do I fund universities to really double down on this? Well, what's the one thing that matters? What is king? Cash. You make the research funding programs speak to legal innovation. And that's what Innovate UK have started to do with their small pots of money. And they do still remain small in the overall public spend. But that's the kind of approach that you need if you're going to really put a fire in the belly and see some change in a shorter window. I don't think we're going to be there. And actually, given the state of our economy coming out of COVID-19, I would say the chances of major investments in academic institutions around those sorts of problems is likely definitely to have been lower now than it was 3 months ago. Buyer adoption, it's linked massively to that skills. So imagine 5 to 10 years from now, the people who are buying legal services, particularly in the B2B environment, so the GC teams, they will be people who will have come out of new schools of thinking. And there's a symbiotic relationship between competencies, knowledge, and comfort, and the ability to buy something I spoke about earlier. But I still think we can make huge traction. And I think the Bridge program is a brilliant example of ways that we can do that. The roadshows that the Barclays Ventures teams have been running are another way of doing that. The Barclays Lab is another way of doing that. The Fuse team and the way in which they are operating and bringing partners in with their cohorts. There are these incremental small changes taking place across the sector. So yeah, in 10 years, I think we'll be in a much healthier, happier state. I think I'm going to leave you just to read this. You can see all the dials. In 10 years, I expect to move significantly to the right. The one I'll note very quickly is there's a really important aspect to this, which is until profitability really matters, i.e. feels like it's under threat, the incentive to change will be relatively limited. And so I see that dynamic changing as competition increases, and you'll see profitability going the other way. I'll leave you with this one, which is the worst case scenario. Not much change, not much gets over the halfway mark. Maybe that's the more pragmatic scenario to aim for, but I'm hoping that's not where we end up. But there is a very plausible future in my view, where actually, particularly on the profitability, you don't get massive profitability gains, but neither does it really feel like it's under threat. Competition makes some gains, but it's not really threatening the incumbents, and infrastructure remains incredibly weak. Data flows remain weak, certainty remains weak, and we haven't changed skill sets in any significant way. And if that is the case, then I expect adoption to remain very low, and profitability to remain, for those in LawTech, selling LawTech, to be still a hard fought after prize. I'll end it there.
Thank you. Yeah, everything was so interesting. I didn't want to stop you. Can we have a big round of applause for Sophia via the applause app?
That was it. Thank you. Thank you. I give you a clap back in an old way, old school. There's one fundamental element to being customer centric, which is starting every single conversation with not what I can sell, but what do you need? And listening, truly listening. So there's a really great example in healthcare, when healthcare moved from being very hierarchy driven to patient centered. There was a movement back in the early mid-90s to early 2000s, which worked really hard at forcing medical professionals to start with the patients and listening to their needs and then responding to that, and then really honing in on the skills that are required to really listen. I think this particular crisis has at least one silver lining, which it has proven not just in law, but in so many sectors, that agility in delivering your services is absolutely plausible and can coexist with profitability. And so how do you maximize on that? Well, actually, I think it's about making this experience as brilliant for people as possible. So utilizing as many of your social media channels to connect with people so that they're living that experience with you in a real way. So, that might just be, think about your marketing practices at the moment, and think about how you might use things like Zoom or other ways of connecting with people to have a little bit of fun, to ingrain in them the fact that this is both not just something we're having to do, but it's something that could continue. I think as we come out of this crisis, there will be a desire for people to snap back to what is regarded as the norm, just because it will also feel like we've survived, right? So if we all go back to our offices and do what we did before, it's all okay. We're all the survivors. But actually, I think there's something about trying to maintain that momentum in little ways. And so, Luke, I don't know which side of the equation you're on, but if you're selling, can you continue this with people to help them become more comfortable with it, see it more as BAU rather than the exception? And if you're in a firm or in your inner in-house team, how do you get your management team to accept that working remotely and using all these sorts of different ways of working can be the norm? It might be you pick one or two things that you definitely think wouldn't be difficult to deliver in that way, and trying to harness that now, bank it now, get a commitment to do it this way now, whilst people are uncertain. Sorry, that's very opportunistic, but it gives you a tail into the future. I think it's both, right? So it's really super helpful because it gets conversations around tables of decision makers who fundamentally hold the purse strings, right? So if there wasn't all this hype, it wouldn't be news, and therefore anyone trying to get a decision maker to make the right decision wouldn't know how to do that, right? They'd get no traction. In the same way as the GDPR noise really got GDPR around the board table and people made changes, in the same way hype is useful. Otherwise, people wouldn't spend money on marketing, right? So hype is just another form of marketing. It's great because it gets your message out there. It's unhelpful when it does two things. One, where people can't decipher the hype and the noise from actual fact. Now, if you're in the territory of selling in that environment, you have to really double down on your efforts to make sure your message is crystal clear and really pointed to the needs of your consumer. So make sure it is absolutely tailored to the needs of the people that you're selling to. Otherwise, it just blends into noise again. And it's unhelpful in the other respect, which is it can assist people or encourage people to have this over egged view of what technology can do. And so when you actually show them what it can do, they become totally disappointed and they're, oh, it was all a bit like snake oil, wasn't it? They feel a bit deflated and they walk away going, well, that was a bit rubbish, wasn't it? And so what do they say? Oh, you meant to under promise and over deliver. Hype makes that really difficult, which is why I think, again, as the hype starts to reduce, and it will do, of course it will do, then being able to cut through that. But in the meantime, I think having very clear messaging around what technologies and what innovative practices, because it's not just about technology, but what innovative practices can do and how they're delivered is really important. So honesty and authenticity about the offer is what people want to really hear. I think totally be opportunistic, right? Right now is your moment to help people get over, and this isn't high tech, like Zoom is not high tech, but for some people it really is, right? So get them comfortable, use this opportunity to hold their hand and lead them through. If you're in a firm that has even an inkling of doing something like reverse mentoring, then try and advocate for that. Find someone who's willing. By reverse mentoring, I mean, if you're more junior in the hierarchy, some organizations will invest time in you being able to essentially mentor a more senior member of your organization in stuff that they are less familiar with, right? That's an opportunity. Also, have a look around at those things that other firms are already using and that have been tried and tested. So the familiarity thing, again, most of your decision makers will probably say, well, what's the risk? Does it work? Who else is using it? How much is it going to cost? And I think starting small in maybe a particular project, working with one practice group, you will have a practice group head somewhere in your firm, I promise you, who is either already on board or is ripe for it. Find that person, make them your best friend. Yeah, sure. I think that is, again, not an unusual concern just to law. It will be with any any institution that is being asked to invest in something, and what happens if it disappears. So the question is, again, be client-centric. What is it that they could still get out of it? Even if that company disappears, what is the thing that they would gain? So actually the sell is not just the technology, but it's upskilling. It's about readiness. It's about the fact that these technologies aren't just unique to one provider of solutions, but they're likely to be the kind of solutions that exist in a number of places, right? And so if your company is already utilizing that approach, you already have the systems in place, operability with other systems, so bugbear of mine, could anyone who's developing anything at the moment do two things? One, make sure it has decent APIs. Two, think about interoperability. Really matters, because if you can talk about its interoperability with other systems, that will overcome some of the fears. And most importantly, like worst case scenario, if that solution does disappear, what does the company get left with other than a bill? Actually, maybe it's something else. Maybe it's huge amounts of experience in investing in the first place. Maybe it's being a leader in a field if it's the kind of firm that feels its brand is everything. Maybe it's skills and experience. There are some great resources online, newsletters, so The Artificial Lawyer, I think the Orange Rag, Legal Insider does kind of updates. There's lots of sort of trade related content around, but I would also say participating in stuff like the Bridge and actually getting your hands dirty with those who are doing some of this work already. I know, for instance, in the access to justice field, they're begging for people who've got some time to help them. There is no better way than to stay on top of things than to simply do it.
Cool, quite right, and hence why we're all here today. Awesome. And I'll plug our newsletter, which you can sign up to at thisiscodebase.com/LawTech bridge. There'll be a link at the end. Legal Geek also do great content around what's happening in the world of legal tech. So yeah, we're just coming up to 4 o'clock, and I'm sure we all want to enjoy our getaways for the Easter weekend, you know, spend time in a different part of the flat. But I just want to say thanks again, Sophia, for coming along and sharing so much with us. Can we get another round of applause, please?
Thank you very much for having me, everyone.